Okay. Many of you were fortunate enough to have met Jim Connell. Jim was, before he passed, he was probably the most respected and knowledgeable person on Canadian clocks. He not only wrote a book, the Carlton Catalogue of Canadian Clocks, but he co-authored two books with Jane Varkaris. You're probably all familiar with them: the Early Canadian Timekeepers and the Hamilton and Canada Clock Companies. Jim was past president of the Toronto chapter many years ago, but he was also quite well known as one of the few directors on the board of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. That's a very small elite group. He was a very humble person. Very few people knew that Jim was actually responsible for the invention of salt and vinegar potato chips. He was working with Griffiths Labs in Toronto as a chemical engineer, and they had a collaboration with a company in the UK that was dealing with a demand for salt and vinegar potato chips. And of course, you can understand that if you poured vinegar over a potato chip, you'd wind up with a bag of soggy mess. But he said he was attending a conference. And by the way, he didn't tell me this. His wife, Marilyn, had to tell me this, and then he explained. But at this conference, they were discussing a chemical compound that tasted like vinegar. So we went back to Griffiths Lab and they came up with a combination that allowed them to produce salt and vinegar potato chips. But again, if you talk to him, he would never have told you, and you'd have to find it out some other way. He was one of these guys that when I first joined and started going to the Toronto meetings, I was kind of intimidated by his knowledge. But one time, Sharon and I went to one of the Toronto Invitational meetings, and the day of the meeting, she and I were having breakfast, waiting for the mart to open. And who should walk in but Jim and his wife Marilyn, and he walked over and asked if he could join us. So he was very, very personable and very, very helpful. And given his knowledge, he was always willing to share it. He was kind of a shy guy. He would never give a presentation in his own right. He didn't mind answering questions in a crowd, but he didn't want to give a presentation. So what he did was he made videos for his presentation, and he'd stand around and answer questions afterwards. So this is one of the videos that he produced, and you have to understand he did this in his 90s, so he's a pretty bright guy. This one is, of course, works well with his background knowledge. It's basically what's unique about Canadian clocks. He did have another video, and they're both available through our website. And that was on restoring a Hamilton Clock Company clock case. So if I can figure this out, I'm going to share my screen to show his video on what's unique about Canadian clocks.
Okay, to begin at the beginning, which Canadian clocks are we talking about? The subject here is clocks which were truly made in Canada. Now, many clocks were imported into Canada and Canadian labels added afterwards, but they are outside the scope of this video. The Canadian clock industry was never a large one, but from the beginning there were makers who fabricated clocks by hand, and in later years, of course, we had factories in Whitby, Hamilton, and Kitchener where clocks were manufactured by industrial method. All these makers, of course, followed the prevailing fashions of the time in both case design and movement construction. But at the same time, these makers did occasionally dare to be different, and this video will show a number of examples of both case design and movement design which can only be found in Canadian clocks. And as we all know, the first significant settlement of Europeans in Canada took place in Quebec. That's an excellent place to start looking for distinctively different Canadian clocks. And shown here, first of all, as a simple line drawing, is the distinctive Quebec case style, which evolved over the years among cabinet makers who were working in Quebec. A relatively large number of these clocks has survived, and while they vary in minor ways from each other, they all conform to this general distinctive case shape. This case style appears to have been popular in Quebec for many years, and it can be found in two forms, a high-priced article and a lower-priced article. In the cities, there were high-quality craftsmen, and they made a number of these clocks, which were fitted with quality veneers such as mahogany and walnut, and were usually equipped with imported movements, usually of British origin. Meanwhile, out in the rural towns and villages, craftsmen copied this big city style with its characteristic tapered waist, but they did not use expensive imported woods. They used simple softwoods such as pine or basswood, and the clocks were decorated with simulated wood grain painting. Some of these latter clocks are quite attractive to look at and have a quaint country style about them, which is very appealing. And now we'll have a look at a few examples of each style. This fine example bears the name of Thomas Drysdale of Quebec City, and it can be seen in Dundurn Castle in Hamilton, Ontario. This second example is probably older. It is fitted with a brass dial, and we know that brass dials phased out at the end of the 18th century, and clocks from that period on had painted dials. In any event, this dial bears the name of James Hanna, who was the first English-speaking clockmaker to arrive in Quebec after the fall of New France. Hanna arrived in the early 1760s and lived in Quebec until about 1808, which would fit in with the probable age of that dial. The case itself is a fine example of the style, and you can see all the characteristics that I had pointed out in that previous line drawing. This third example bears the name of Michel Lamontagne in Quebec City, and is one of the most attractive examples I have seen of this style. You'll note that it has elegant turned rope style columns both beside the dial and in the waist section. It's all around a very attractive clock. And this shot will provide a better view of the upper portion of that clock. Finally, this clock, which bears the name of William Baxter of Quebec City, is interesting because it contains the possible name of the craftsman who made the case. Inscribed within the box is the name of Joseph Marcoux, and it's dated 1822 with a street address in Quebec City where cabinet makers were active. And now for a bit of contrast, we can look at some of the country style cases which were made by local carpenters and craftsmen in smaller communities in Quebec. As I said before, they were made of softwoods, grain painted to resemble fine mahogany, and they were fitted usually with 30-hour or 8-day wood movement. This would have been a very much less expensive clock at the time of sale, but the form does adhere to all the characteristics of that tapered waist style. There is still some artificial wood graining visible on this clock, and when it was new it probably gave a passable impression of being mahogany. In this example we can see some very nice artificial graining, which was probably done with a feather or graining tools and using a variety of brownish colored paint. And I can enlarge that central portion so that you can have a better view of the kind of work that was done by the original craftsman. The net effect is quaint and rather attractive. Now, unfortunately, over the years, dealers and collectors were quick to strip some of these old hand-painted clocks, thinking they were ugly, and in reality they only reduced their value. The next clock has been stripped. I've included it here because, in spite of the fact that it's been stripped, it is an excellent example of the type, and we know the name of the man who made it. It's the only one of these country clocks that we've been able to tie down to a specific maker, who was Michel Rousseau, who lived in the village of Lotbinière, which is about 35 miles west of Quebec City on the St. Lawrence River. One of the gentleman's granddaughters later wrote a book in which she included the story of this clock. Now, before I leave the subject of these country clocks, I'm including a photograph here of the movement from the first of the three clocks previously shown. It's basically similar to clocks made at the time in New England, but when examined carefully, there are a number of characteristics which do not line up with the output of any of the known New England makers. This in turn has raised the question, was somebody in Quebec actually making wood movements at this time? A lot more research has to be done on this topic before we can draw any definite conclusions, but someday we may well be able to say that here too we have something unique about clocks that were made north of the border. And those comments are really just a lead-in to this remarkable clock, which we know was made in Quebec. Not only the case, but the movement. And the movement itself is unique in the whole field of clockmaking. Now, the clock itself is currently on display at the Canadian Clock Museum in Deep River, Ontario. The proprietor of that museum, Mr. Alan Simmons, has already given the clock a good deal of publicity in talks and published articles, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details, but I will attempt to talk about some of the highlights. To summarize, this is an 8-day tall case clock with a wood movement. This wood movement has 3 trains: time, strike, and quarter-hour strike. And the strike system operates on 4 bells. In addition, the clock has a moon roller. It has secondary hands that give both the day of the month and the day of the week. The documentation which accompanies the clock confirms that it was actually made by one Xavier Clément, a spinning wheel maker in the village of Saint Martin, which was north of Montreal. And it further confirms that he copied another known movement in Quebec. In this picture of the dial, the moon phase indicator can clearly be seen. At the top of the dial there is a standard seconds hand, and below it is another secondary dial with 2 hands, one of which shows the day of the month and the second shows the day of the week. Both the dial and the moon wheel are made of wood. This is a view of the movement, and at the top at the back you can see the moon wheel. In front of it are the 4 bells of the strike mechanism, and below that is the 3 train wood movement. We can see 2 count wheels. The wheel on the right is quite familiar. It is similar to the 12-hour count wheels which are used in New England clocks of the same time period. But the count wheel on the left, which controls the quarter-hour strike, is totally unique, and no other example of it is known at the present time. Not only is this count wheel unique, but the whole clock is unique, because nowhere else in the whole realm of clockmaking has anyone as yet reported another example of a three-train wood movement with quarter-hour strike. The other features of a moon roller and a day of the week indicating hand are both unique as well. The clock at the present time is in operating condition in all respects except the moon dial, where the connecting wheels appear to have been lost. So to sum up, this extraordinary clock has to be recognized as totally unique in the field of wood clockmaking and is definitely domiciled to Quebec. So far in this video, all we've been looking at is tall case clocks. And before I leave the subject, I just want to comment that many other cases of distinctive design can be found which are definitely of Quebec origin. The only specimen which I'll illustrate is this rather uninhibited example of a hood made for Savage & Son in Montreal. And now, finally, I'm going to stop talking about Quebec grandfather clocks and switch over to some interesting wall clocks. And the next individual that I want to talk about is Mr. Martin Cheney, who operated a shop in Montreal on St. Paul Street in the approximate period of 1809 to about 1830. Martin Cheney was an American by birth, the son of Benjamin Cheney, who was a very famous early American clockmaker in business as early as the 1740s. Martin Cheney first began his business in Windsor, Vermont around the year 1802, but moved to Montreal in 1809 and spent the rest of his life in Canada. We don't have a lot of formal documentation of Cheney's years in Montreal, but from a study of his surviving clocks, it is apparent that he was able to manufacture movements in his shop, and he cased them in locally made cases which were of distinctive design, obviously made by Montreal craftsmen. Cheney appears to have been successful in his business, and a fairly large number of his clocks have survived. Both the cases and the movements are different in many respects from contemporary American production. This wall clock appears to be one of his most successful designs because quite a number of them have survived. In many respects they resemble contemporary American products, but there are some differences. One rather unexpected one is the fact that the bezel hinge is at the top and you have to lift the glass to access the hands. And most of Cheney's clocks had a small window in the lower section for which you could see the pendulum. Cheney also sold a number of clocks in this case style, and it appears to be unique to Montreal. We have not seen clocks of other origins in this style of case. The movements in all these Cheney clocks were simple, 8-day, time-only, weight-driven, banjo-type movements. There were some variations within the movements themselves as the years went by, but he did not offer other movement options in these wall clocks. Other clocks in this case style had minor differences in detailing, which can be seen clearly here. This example is in the same family, but may have lost some of its original ornamentation. And we'll now move over into banjo clocks. Martin Cheney did offer elegant presentation banjo clocks in Montreal, and these are two examples. They followed the general pattern of banjo clocks in the U.S., but if you look at some of the fine details, such as those herringbone decorations at the very bottom of the case, these appear to be unique to cases that were made in Montreal. The case on the left has some very interesting little handwritten notes stuck inside the lower portion of the case. The notes were written by an old lady who was leaving the clock to her darling nephew, who had never spoken an unkind word to her. She also volunteers the information that her father bought the clock in 1825 for $40, which gives us a yardstick on the value of these clocks at that time, because in 1825, $40 would have been a lot of money. And here are two fine all-mahogany banjos by Martin Cheney. This case style appears to be entirely unique to products coming from his shop. And if you think back to that distinctive wall clock that I showed a few moments ago, these clocks all have a common characteristic, and the cases probably all came from the same woodworking shop. That tapered lower section is very distinctive. And here is a third example, and you can see some variations in the details. Now we can see a certain evolution in the movements which Cheney made in Montreal. This appears to have been the first, and it has been designated as Type A. A few years later, in this Type B designation, he has begun filing out some of the brass in the gear wheels and has used a little less brass in the plates. But brass was expensive, and by the time we come to the Type C designation, Cheney has reduced the amount of brass in the plates and has reduced the number of posts from 4 to 3. And in this final variant, the movement post and the pendulum suspension post have been combined into one unit, which would minimize the use of brass for that purpose. These latter movements probably date from the late 1820s, by which time Cheney would have been feeling very much the competitive pressure of cheap clock movements being produced in the U.S. by mass production methods. These mass production methods, pioneered by Eli Terry and Chauncey Jerome and others, made it impossible for handcrafted clockmakers like Martin Cheney to continue to compete. And before we leave Cheney, I will show an illustration of his characteristic silversmith stamp, which was used to mark many of his movements. Now, any discussion on Quebec clocks would be incomplete without at least a mention of the Twist brothers. They were active in Montreal during the 1820 to 1840 period, when they sold a large number of 30-hour wood movement tall case clocks. Twist clocks are well known, and there is really little about their appearance which is novel. The cases are similar to comparable material made in the U.S., and their movements were always imported from Connecticut. But the clock shown here, which has been attributed to the Twist brothers, is certainly distinctive. It is a simple tower clock with a wood movement and has an interesting history. The story goes that it was installed in the post office of a village about 40 miles north of Montreal called Saint-Scholastique. At some stage, the clock was taken out of the post office for repairs, and during that period the post office caught fire and burned, and the clock was never reclaimed. The clock apparently was left abandoned in a farmer's barn for the best part of a century, until it was finally discovered by antique dealers and introduced into the antique trade about 40 years ago. But the clock itself is certainly worthy of note. It is unique, and no similar item has ever been reported from any source either in Canada or the USA. It's also interesting to note that the village of Saint-Scholastique no longer exists. It was bulldozed out of existence to make way for that notorious Montreal Mirabel Airport. When you look at the movement, the first thing you notice is that it is all wood, and secondly that it is quite large. And when you look more closely, you realize that the design and layout is identical to the tall case 30-hour movements that were made in New England about that time period. But in all its dimensions, the movement is exactly twice as big. The movement plates shown here are exactly 18 inches wide and 22 inches high, which is approximately double the dimensions of a standard household clock. No other clock has been reported either in Canada or the US that we are aware of which matches the characteristics of this item. The Twist brothers have never been credited with the manufacture of movements. In fact, they routinely preferred to buy them from other sources. But on the other hand, they were experienced clockmakers. They did hold some patents. So it is at least possible that they did create this movement from first principles. So once again, following our theme, here is another example of something unique out of Quebec which bears no relationship to products made elsewhere. Now it's time to leave Quebec and have a brief visit into the Maritime provinces. Many clocks were sold in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in the early 1800s by several Canadian and American peddlers. A fine example is shown here of an American triple-decker sold by the legendary Moses Barrett. Most clocks during this period were simply imported from Connecticut and resold. I think it's fair to say that there was no significant manufacture of movements in the Maritimes, and most cases which may have been made there followed successful American designs. When we look at the city of St. John in New Brunswick, however, I do have to make an exception to that statement because there were some interesting cases that came out of that town. The label shown here is from a clock by Whitcomb Fairbanks, and on the label he states that he has a shop located on Germain Street, 2 doors north of King Street. And he has for sale a line of looking glasses, picture frames, clocks, and silver. And on this clock we find a label for Plummer and Mitchell, and they were located 4 doors north of King Street on Germain. And their line of products was exactly similar to those of Mr. Fairbanks. So these men were obviously competitors, but when we look into their personal lives, we find that Plummer and Fairbanks were actually related to each other by marriage. We don't have a lot of information about their day-to-day business activities, but it does seem evident that they worked together to produce a line of clock cases which are unique to St. John and were probably made there. The clock fitted with weight-driven American brass movements from several suppliers. This clock was sold by Whitcomb Fairbanks, and as you can see, the general layout is similar to American clocks of the period, but the actual details of the design of the case are unique. And this clock was sold by the Plummer and Mitchell firm and is exactly similar to the Fairbanks clock which you just saw previously. And I can show 2 other clocks here which bear the labels of Plummer or Plummer and Mitchell, and they too are of a distinctive case style. And not to be outdone, Fairbanks offered this rather unusual case as well. St. John has never been recognized as a major clock-making center, but I think it's fair to state that some original work was certainly done there during this time period. Now it's time to move farther west to that area which was first Upper Canada, then Canada West, and finally Ontario. And the first clockmaker to arrive in Upper Canada was Jordan Post, pictured here. Post was born in Connecticut, where he probably received his clockmaking training. He worked for a number of years in the United States, but the Post family moved en masse to York, Upper Canada in 1802, and Jordan continued in business here until the time of his death in 1845. Post became very active in real estate matters and developed several areas of what is now downtown Toronto. and undoubtedly he made more money in real estate than he did in clockmaking. But several clocks have survived from those early days when Post had his shop in muddy York, which of course is now Toronto. Post, of course, supplied the mechanical parts of these clocks, and someone else made the case. The cases generally were attractive and well made, but had no unusual characteristics. Some of his dials, however, were distinctive. And here is a rare example of a Post dial which is made out of pure copper. It's a thin sheet copper riveted to an iron backplate. Sheet copper tarnishes easily, and no other maker that I know of ever attempted to use it to make dials. Some of his dials, of course, were brass, and this one has an interesting detail at the top. We see a village on the left, a fortress on the right, and a sailing ship in the background. And I have always suspected that this was a depiction of muddy York on the left, Fort York on the right, and a rocking ship on Lake Ontario, as Post would have seen it in the early 1800s. Now, critics of Toronto will probably say that the city really hasn't changed that much. They didn't have the traffic problems we do, or the kind of mayor. However, let's move on and look at some of the movements in Jordan Post clocks. They are quite distinctive. Post advertised that he would buy scrap brass, and he had a forge at the back of his shop, so he obviously melted down brass, cast his own parts, and filed them out as needed. Post's movements followed the common practice of the period with rack and snail spike and other features which were originally developed in Britain. But brass was scarce and expensive, and he economized wherever he could by skeletonizing the plates as much as he dared. And all known Post movements from York are similar to those shown here. Post probably learned this procedure in New England, where it was occasionally used by other makers, but I don't think any of them removed quite as much metal as he did. Before I leave Jordan Post, however, I should mention briefly one of his apprentices, Mr. Charles Clinkenbroomer, who actually was born in what is now Toronto in 1799 and graduated from Post's shop as an accredited clockmaker. This Clinkenbroomer clock has been extensively studied, and we believe that there is another one, but its whereabouts are currently unknown. The most obvious feature of this clock is once again the use of copper to make the dial. This is a most unusual practice, and the only two examples we know of, which have been shown here, can be traced back to the shop of Jordan Post. We have heard a story that Clinkenbroomer actually melted down English pennies, which in those days were made of pure copper, and hammered these out to make his dial. The dial itself is rather attractive, but at the same time eccentric. It is decorated with birds and flowers in the fashion of Pennsylvania Dutch fracture art. And that story does really seem to be rather credible, because pure copper would have been hard to find otherwise. And at least Clinkenbroomer would have known how much the metal cost to make his dial. The Clinkenbroomer movement is indistinguishable from the work of Jordan Post, obviously came out of the same shop. The Monty Python show used to have a line, "And now for something completely different." And here we have it. This fine old church is the Church of St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran, and it's located in Zurich, Ontario, and as you can see, it's got a fine clock in its tower. Zurich, Ontario is located near Lake Huron, north of Sarnia, south of Goderich. And in the 1860s, a German-born clockmaker named George Hess arrived in Zurich, where he set up a shop and spent the rest of his life. Hess was proficient in many aspects of clockmaking and eventually became interested in the manufacture of tower clocks. He also secured 2 Canadian patents on some of his work. His first tower clock was installed in this church in Zurich around 1880. And as you can see, it doesn't really look like any other tower clock. The frame for the clock is made of wood with brass bearings bolted to it. The wheels are commercial cast iron gears. And that paint job looks more like it belonged on an agricultural implement rather than a tower clock mechanism. One of Hess's Canadian patents was for his tower clock escapements, and you can get a clear view of it here. And a year later, Hess installed another clock, this time in the village of Tavistock, Ontario, in the Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church on the outskirts of Tavistock. This clock is a more elegant design. It has a more finely crafted wood frame, but once again he used a combination of wood frame and iron gears. In this case, the gears are spoked rather than solid cast iron. And the same Hess brass escapement can be seen in the background. And Hess's third clock was installed in 1888 in the town hall at Exeter, Ontario, which is a few miles from Zurich. Now, as luck would have it, the Exeter clock was replaced a number of years ago by an electric mechanism, and the movement was abandoned in the tower, and several of its parts were removed. However, I'm happy to state that the movement has since been removed from the tower. The missing parts have been restored to it, and it is on public display, even though it's not running. And so, even though George Hess's market was rather small and his production was limited, he did make some interesting and novel clock movements. And as an aside, he was also famous for his beard, which was said to be 28 inches long. Unfortunately, I guess he never managed to get it tangled up in any of his clock gears. And now it's time to move to another small town in Ontario, Whitby. Here in 1872, the first formal clock manufacturing factory was established. Its output was small, and the company was basically financially unsuccessful, and there is little to report on novelty among its products. However, in 1876, the equipment was moved to Hamilton, Ontario, and a new company, the Hamilton Clock Company, was established to carry on the work which had been begun in Whitby. With the development of clock factories, of course, the old handcrafted clockmakers were all put out of business, and the balance of this video will be concerned with commercial clocks manufactured in Canada. The Hamilton Clock Company offered a variety of mantel and wall clocks, and both cases and movements were made in their own factory. Generally speaking, their products were of good quality, and they closely resembled competitive materials being brought in from the USA, with a couple of exceptions. Hamilton was already an industrial town, and among other industries there were two major glass factories, both of whom offered window glass. As a result, the clock company was able to offer a variety of etched glass tablets in their models, which is quite distinctive and unlike anything offered by other companies. This OG is fitted with a mirror which has been etched with the company's name. And among their products, the company offered the only steeple clocks ever made in Canada, an example of which is seen here. But we need to have a closer look at that tablet. And interestingly enough, it has a religious message, Godspeed the plow. And when we look at other examples of Hamilton clocks, we see that there are a whole series of these images, and since they're quite unusual, I'll illustrate several of them here. This cling to the cross glass also appeared in steeple clocks. And this one, which was probably aimed for the Quebec market, the message in French, roughly translated, means that I will be rewarded for giving. To me, the most amusing part of that tablet is that beaver. He has ears like a cat, legs like a dog, and he has stripes. He was a very rare species indeed, probably only ever seen in Hamilton. This OG glass has been decorated with a bishop's hat and crossed keys, which have a religious significance. And these two OGs have further religious connotation. Consider the lilies and a cross with a vine growing on it. Perhaps the company hoped to get divine assistance with these tablets, but evidently they were not successful because production was limited and they were out of business in 3 or 4 years. As I said before, there was little novelty in the movements which they manufactured. However, when we look at this Hamilton Clock Company schoolhouse, we see a wind-up hole at a rather unusual spot. Now, as it happened, the company had limited capital and had only invested in dies to make 3 or 4 movements. They did not have a separate, time-only, 8-day spring-driven movement. They did, of course, have a perfectly satisfactory 8-day time and strike movement shown here. So they took the easy way out and they cut that movement in half and just installed the time side as a separate entity. This shortcut is seldom if ever seen among the products of other makers, but in principle it seemed to work all right because this movement still runs happily almost a century and a half later. From a collector's standpoint, clocks by the Hamilton Clock Company are extremely rare. Some of the models exist in only 1 or 2 known surviving copies. This little clock, which is named the Simpson, is an example of those. It is, as far as I know, a 1 only, and it was named after the president of the company. James Simpson was president of the Hamilton Clock Company for the 4 years of its existence, but in 1880 he completely reorganized the company, found new investors, and made some radical changes in the production methods. The company from that time forward was known as the Canada Clock Company Limited. Manufacturing continued in the same building, and both cases and movements were made at the site. The movements were of good quality, but they were very similar in their lines to competitive American movements. There was nothing novel or unusual about them. They completely revamped their case production, however. The practice of veneering was abandoned completely, and all cases from that time forward were made of solid wood. Some cases were close copies of successful American designs, but others were unique to this company, and I will illustrate a few of them. Here is an example of one of their 30-hour OGs. As I mentioned, there is no longer any veneer, and the curved portion of this clock has been painted with an imitation wood grain, which may or may not be an improvement. The wood employed here is solid butternut, and this combination of butternut lumber and grain-painted finish is unique in the whole field of OG clock. These attractive little cottage clocks are made from solid mahogany. They are the City of London and the City of Paris, and they are richly decorated with carving. These 2 mantel clocks, the City of Hamilton and the Tilly, also exhibit fine turning and a profusion of excellent wood carving. It must have been very expensive in terms of labor cost, and one wonders whether they were ever actually able to recover their labor costs and their selling prices. But for reasons which were never made public, the company did fail financially in 1884, and all production stopped. And that put an end to all production of clocks in Canada for the next 20 years, until this well-known name appeared. The story of Arthur Pagano, Canada's most successful clockmaker, has been told before and need not be repeated here. Pagano movements were manufactured in this building, and the cases were made in a woodworking shop a few miles out of town. Generally speaking, his movements were well made, and many of them are happily running 100 years later, but there was really nothing novel in their design. However, when we look at his cases, he did have some rather interesting articles. Pagano clocks faced strong competition from imported American clocks, and during his years of production, Arthur copied many successful American designs, but he also had the courage to design some of his own cases, and these are the ones which are of interest. I will illustrate a few typical items in the following. When Pagano started production in 1904, mission styling was very popular, and there were many mission-style clocks on the market. Arthur designed his own cases, and this Belleville model is an attractive example. He also did some rather unusual things. These maple leaf kitchen clocks were basically done in the mission style, but they seem to have been strongly influenced by the good old-fashioned steeple clock. The result is two case designs which are pleasing and yet totally unique to Pagano. But I have to say that not all his designs are equally successful. This Monarch kitchen clock, in my personal opinion, is both awkward and clumsy in its design. However, Arthur did sell a number of them, but it would appear that later on he decided to redesign the case, and he came up with this alternative, which may or may not be an improvement. And then there were these little Dominion cottage clocks, which will never win a beauty contest. I once saw an empty case of one of these, which had been made into a birdhouse, and it somehow seemed appropriate. At the other end of the spectrum, however, the company did offer this magnificent mantel clock, the Citadel, which would be impressive in any home. The brass plaque at the top states that the clock had been presented in 1912 to the Sergeant's Mess of the Canadian Highlanders Regiment. In the early years of production, many Pagano mantel clocks were plain, simple little items like this, which resembled American clocks of the period. But later in the 1920s, they did do some updating of styles. Clocks of this form show a bit of influence by Art Nouveau or Art Deco styling, and are quite pleasing in their form. And still other clocks were attractive in their own right and are eagerly sought by Pagano collectors. Production ceased at the Pagano factory during World War II, and I think this is a good time to terminate this video. So just to wind things up, we will show the friendly face of Arthur Pagano and his magnificent mustache and allow him to say au revoir.
That was a fantastic video. I really learned a lot from that one. 2014, that doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it's getting there. We'd like to have, I guess, solicit any comments that people had about that video. The one, I was going to say the one thing I was thinking of was how uncandid he was on the design styles of certain clocks. I must admit, I find I have the same guttural reaction to certain styles of clocks, and it was kind of interesting to hear him have the same sort of thing. Any comments from people?
I hope that video and share screen worked, because I couldn't tell.
It worked great, Gary.
Good stuff. How did everyone enjoy it?
Excellent.
Gary, Nick here. I loved it. You might remember I bought that book that Connell and Vacaris wrote when I was out at the last meeting, and so it was a perfect fit because it's about Canadian clockmakers, and there they were with a commentary. It was terrific.
they were a good pair for writing because Jane was deep into genealogy. And so you pair that up, her experience and knowledge in that area with Jim's experience with the clocks themselves and his research and his collection. And they made a very powerful book. I had actually hoped that Alan would have been online to talk about some of the clocks, the unique clocks that he has in his collection to match what Jim was telling us. In any event, there is another very good video by Jim on the repair of a Hamilton clock company. If I recall, it was a steeple clock case. And it's really quite good. And again, it's on the video page or the link is on the video page of our club website.
So that information or that video is
So
also
that's
available, right?
Yep. Yep. Both videos are.
Good. Kevin and I were texting back and forth during the beginning of the video, and I don't know if anybody else noticed, but one of the first wooden movement clocks that he showed the back of, it looked like somebody had been doing bushing work on the some of the gears, and it looked like it might have been bone bushings that the person put in because it was white. So there was white white areas around where the pivot would have been poking through. So I thought that was interesting too, because from wooden movements, bone bushings were a common solution. Any other comments?
Yeah, John here. That last Pagano clock that was shown the picture, it's like Gothic style clock, very plain, simple, standalone clock. I just picked that up in Maxville yesterday for a customer to refurbish that. The screen is collapsed on it, and the paint is spalling, and that's really difficult because some of these zinc dial faces, the dial pan itself, the paint over the years it just lets go, it just won't stay on. And that's an interesting one to try and fix. Like, how do you preserve something like that when it's literally disintegrating on you? But it's a 1914 clock because it was written Berlin on it. And I'm assuming he changed the name, that he changed his stamping at the time that Kitchener changed his name. Berlin changed the name to Kitchener. Not really sure if they changed immediately at the same time. But it's a steel plate. Almost looks like it's chromium. It's a steel plated clock with punched in brass bushings. And it's got a 1914 stamp on it. Very interesting clock to work on. Not sure what I'm going to do with the dial pan. I'm going to bring that up at the meeting on Tuesday.
Now it's time for show and tell. I'd like to offer anybody who's on the call to offer anything that they may have in their collection that they'd like to show and discuss. Just unmute yourself when you do it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Don, can you hear me? Talking
Yep.
about Arthur Pagano clocks, I have a clock here, which is not an Arthur Pagano clock. And I'll just show you the clock. It's a Sir Thomas clock, and I bought it in Prince Edward Island, and it has a visible escapement on it. And I was always disappointed because there was an Arthur Pagano clock right above it. And the guy in the store said to me, why don't you buy the Arthur Pagano clock instead of this one?
Mm.
I didn't know anything about Arthur Pagano at the time. And so I chose the pretty one, which was the Sir Thomas.
Yeah.
Anyway, so many years later, in fact, 2 or 3 years ago, I spoke to Dan Hewden, our clock instructor, and asked him about it. And he said, you made the right choice, he said. I guess Dan Hewden wasn't a big fan of Arthur Pagano clocks, because of their kind of hybrid nature where some of the movements were imported, and the cases were original design. Dan didn't seem to be much of an enthusiast for Arthur Pacano clocks, and he certainly wasn't enthusiastic about the high prices that many people have in the past paid for them.
Yeah.
So I was kind of reassured, because up until that point, I was very disappointed that I missed a good opportunity, But I guess it comes down to the fact that if you're a Canadian fan, collector of Canadian-made products, then obviously just Seth Thomas is outside of that jurisdiction. But it does look nice, and it's worked very well over the years. And as you see, I bought a little decoration about a month ago to put on the top of it, a clock topper. And usually when you buy clocks, they don't have a clock topper with them. But in the old days, many clock toppers available in the catalogs to go with your clock. So you could choose the marble clock and then choose a clock topper of your choice, which might be a horse, it could be a reclining lady. And you find these things in antique shops, usually stuffed away in a corner somewhere. Nobody really knows what they are or what to do with them. And to me, I have a couple now that I've back together with marble clocks. And I think it adds a little touch of elegance to the clock itself,
It does.
That's it.
Yeah, just to John here, just to mention my clock movement. I don't know if you can see how bad the spalling is. Somebody's touched it up what looks like maybe fingernail paint or something, and but it continues to crack and fall off, and not sure if there's anything that can be done to preserve this clock face. And it is a Pacano original from a little steeple clock, but anyway, we can talk about it on Tuesday.
Thank you.